Excellent. Thank you so much for joining us, everyone. We will get started in just a moment. We will be recording this evening, so if you'd like to take a moment to change the way your name displays, please take a moment to do that. We also ask that you put any questions you may have for Vin in the Q&A box. We will answer questions at the end. If you have any other, anything else that you need to get in touch with us about, please feel free to put that in the chat, or if you'd like to chat with the other attendees, you are welcome to chat in the chat box. So I just want to inform you that we are recording this evening, which I will start now, and I will welcome Vin, and then we're ready to go. All right. This recording will also be available on our YouTube channel, and we will also have the Facebook Live feed up. Okay. So, Vincent, are you all set? I'm going to go ahead and start recording.
Okay.
Thank you so much for being here this evening, attendees. And Vincent, we are so thankful that Vincent could join us tonight and talk about his work and research on Phillis Wheatley. So I will briefly introduce Phillis Wheatley and Vincent, and then we are ready for Vincent's presentation. Phillis Wheatley, born in thought to be 1753 to 1784, was a pioneer of African British, African American, and African literature. Kidnapped from West Africa as a child and enslaved in Boston, Phillis Wheatley became the first English-speaking author of African descent to publish a book of poems in 1773. With poems on various subjects, religious and moral, Wheatley, while still a teenager, became an international celebrity, moving in the same circles as the most important military, political, religious, and popular figures of the day. Vincent Carretta, scholar and author of Phillis Wheatley, Biography of a Genius in Bondage, will discuss Wheatley's works, life, and legacy. So, Vin Carretta, I feel like we've gotten to know each other very well, Vincent. Over the past month, we've been planning the program. Is Professor Emeritus of English at the University of Maryland and specializes in transatlantic historical and literary studies during the long 18th century. Vin's most recent books include Equiano, the African, Biography of a Self-Made Man, 2005, The Life and Letters of Philip Kwaku, the first African Anglican missionary, 2010, co-edited with Ty M. Reese. Phillis Wheatley, A Biography of a Genius in Bondage, from 2011, and an edition of the letters of the late Ignatius Sancho, an African, 2015. In November 2019, Oxford University Press published Vin's edition of the writings of Phillis Wheatley. And we just wanted to let you know that we do have both Vin's biography of Phillis and the Oxford University Press edition of the writings of Phillis Wheatley here for you to take out. You can place a hold right now if you'd like and check it out from the library. So without further ado, Vincent.
Well, thank you, Britt, for your introduction, and thank you all for giving me the chance to talk about Phillis Wheatley. And the title I'm taking, A Wonder of the Age Indeed, is from a letter that someone wrote in which he's describing Phillis Wheatley, his having met her. This is Phillis Wheatley. This is the frontispiece to her book that was published in 1773. I'll get back to this soon in this talk, but you can see she was at most 20 years old when this picture was taken. We know a fair amount about Phillis Wheatley's life. There are some major gaps, one of which involves Wilmington that I'll get to later on. But we know when she arrived at Boston. We know the day on which she arrived in Boston. We know the name of the ship that she arrived on in Boston. But we're not sure where she came from in Africa. And this is a contemporaneous map of Africa. You can see, I think, that it indicates that Europeans and Americans didn't know much about Africa. If you notice, they have Ethiopia right in the center of Africa. During the 18th century, Ethiopia was, or an Ethiopian was used to refer to anyone of African descent. But Phillis Wheatley most likely came from, if you look at the West African part, the green, which is entitled Negro Land, and below it the yellow, which is entitled Guinea. She probably most likely came from that area of West Africa. She arrived in Boston in 1761, the summer of 1761. She was about 7 years old. We know that because there were contemporaneous accounts of her missing her two front teeth. She was bought by Susanna and John Wheatley. John Wheatley was a significant merchant in Boston. He had a transatlantic business, and his wife Susanna was an evangelical Christian who was connected to the Evangelical Christian Network that too was transatlantic. And this played a very important role in Phillis's access to the major figures in politics, religion, literature that Britt referred to in her introduction. Now, Phillis was named by the Wheatleys after the ship that brought her from Africa. That ship was named the Phillis. The Wheatleys, as evangelical Christians, especially Susanna Wheatley, believed that all people should be exposed to Christianity, which meant that they believed that all people should be given access to reading. So they encouraged Phillis to learn to read. She was very precocious. She was very smart. The Wheatleys recognized this quickly, so they gave her access to books beyond the Bible, including translations of classical literature. And they began to sort of show her off as someone who demonstrated both their own piety and Phillis's own education, her own abilities. So we know that Phillis, remember, she arrived in 1761. She, of course, knew no English at all. By 1765, she was starting to write poetry. We have a number of poems that exist only in manuscript that she didn't publish, but she published her first poem in a newspaper in Rhode Island. Remember, she was living in Boston, so her owners gave her access to a Rhode Island newspaper. And that was published in 1767 when she was about 14 years old. So think of how many of you out there have published in newspapers by the time you were 14. I know I certainly didn't. So we have Phillis starting to publish. She gained her international and transatlantic fame with her first published major poem. And this was an elegiac poem on the death of the Reverend George Whitefield. published in 1770. It had this as the cover. This is the cover to the poem. It was published first in Boston at the end of 1770, within just a few weeks of Whitfield's death. Now, Whitfield was a very major evangelical preacher who made 7 preaching tours he came from England, made 7 preaching tours throughout the American colonies, and he died during his last preaching tour in 1770. So Wheatley wrote a poem on George Whitfield. She addressed the poem to Whitfield's sponsor, his patron, the Honorable Countess of Huntingdon. Now, the Countess of Huntingdon sponsored a number of evangelical preachers and missionaries that she sent from England to the American colonies. And what I have here before you is, of course, a picture of George Whitfield. He was renowned for his ability to project his voice. He reportedly was able to speak to hundreds of people in open fields and have them hear him. And I've just quoted here some of the lines from Wheatley's poem that indicate how she moves from Americans to include Africans as Americans, as equal Americans. What she's doing here is, the lines that I'm quoting here are her ventriloquizing Wheatley's voice. She's imagining him speaking to his audience, and the hymn that he refers to is Christ. So take him, my dear Americans, he said, be your complaints in his kind bosom laid. Take him, ye Africans, he longs for you. Impartial Savior is his title due. If you will choose to walk in grace's road, you shall be sons and kings and priests to God. Great Countess, we Americans revere thy name and thus condole thy grief sincere. We mourn with thee that tomb obscurely placed, in which thy chaplain undisturbed does rest. So notice what she does. She has him address Americans and Africans as if they're 2 separate categories initially, but then she combines them and talks about we Americans. So this is one of her earliest attempts to identify herself as a kind of spokesperson for a kind of unofficial poet laureate for the colonies, for America. And this was addressed to the Countess of Huntingdon. Wheatley sent the Countess a copy of the poem, and then she included a letter with it. Now, this was really quite amazing, because Phillis Wheatley at this point is maybe 19, 20 years old. She's an enslaved young woman in America, in the American colonies, and she's writing a letter. She initiates a correspondence with one of the most powerful women in the British Empire, the Countess of Huntingdon. Now, the Countess of Huntingdon was not anti-slavery. In fact, she, upon the death of Whitfield, she inherited a plantation in Georgia which had slaves, but she was a major evangelical. She sponsored a number of the earliest Black authors besides Phillis Wheatley. And so she's a very significant figure. When the book came out in 1773, before the book came out, the Countess of Huntingdon sent a number of missionaries to visit Phillis Wheatley to see if she was indeed for real, basically, to see if she was capable of having written these poems. And they reported back to her, as the title indicates, as one of them reported back to the Countess of Huntingdon, that she was a wonder of the age indeed. One of them, for example, visited the Wheatley household in Boston, gave Wheatley a poetic assignment. Phillis said, well, give me overnight, and the next morning produced a poem on it, which was subsequently published. So this was the book that came out. As Britt mentioned, it's the first book by a person, an author of African descent in the English-speaking world. You can see Phillis here composing. There's a book on the table in front of her. We don't know whether that book is, to represent her own book of poetry, whether it's to represent the Bible, whether it's simply to represent the fact that she was literate, that she could read and write. She's humbly dressed as a servant, which was a euphemism, which means a kind of a nice way of saying slave in 18th century Boston. So she was still a slave when she wrote this, when she published this. To help publicize the book in 1773, she was sent by Susanna Wheatley to London, where Phillis spent 6 weeks. We fortunately have a letter that she wrote to someone when she returned to America, in which she describes her experiences in London. And it's a really remarkable letter because she tells us, or she tells her correspondent, David Wooster, that she visited many of the same sites you would visit today if you went to London. She says she went to the British Museum, she went to the Tower of London, she went to the Greenwich Hospital, she went to a play. Now, plays were forbidden in Boston, so this is the first time she went to the theater. And she met a number of people there, members of the aristocracy, authors, scientists, and one of the people that she met, that she tells us, is Benjamin Franklin, who of course at the time was representing the colonies in England. One of the people that she met was Granville Sharp. Granville Sharp may not be known to you, but he was probably the most important person that Phillis Wheatley met there. She tells us that he was her tour guide to places like the Tower of London. Now, Granville Sharp, the year before, in 1772, had brought a case before the British courts that ruled in his favor, and the ruling was that no enslaved person brought from the colonies to Britain could legally be forced back to the colonies as a slave. And this ruling in 1772 was widely reported in the newspapers throughout the colonies, including Boston, before Phillis left for England. It's extremely unlikely that the subject of the fact that Phillis could liberate herself in London by refusing to go back to America would not have come up while she's talking to Granville Sharp. Because at this point, Phillis Wheatley was the most famous person of African descent in the British Empire. So Phillis tells her correspondent that she, after she had returned to Boston. She arrived in Boston back in September, just as her book was being published in London. And she's writing to her correspondent in October, and she tells him that she has been freed. She says, at the desire of my friends in London, in England, rather. And I'm pretty sure what happened is that she told her owners, she let them know that she would not return unless they guaranteed that she would be freed. Now, she was a remarkably smart young woman, very savvy about publishing and about her rights. So what she did, she also tells this correspondent, is that while she was in London, she made sure that she sent a copy of her agreement with her owners that she would be freed, and she says in the letter to guarantee her property, whatever she owned at the time and whatever she was going to own in the future, anticipating profits from her book, etc. And she also tells her correspondent that to guarantee that copies of her book were not pirated, in other words, reproduced without her getting any of the profits from it, any of the royalties from it, that she was going to sign the copies of the book when they arrived in America, which she did. Next. Now the book brought her great notice throughout the colonies. She also, once the book was published and once she was freed, she became much more overt, much more direct in her denunciations of slavery than she ever had been before in any of the things that she had published. Because as a slave, she had to be careful as to what she said about slavery. Now, the person here, Samson Occam, he was a Presbyterian Mohegan Indian minister in North America. He was also part of the transatlantic evangelical circle that helped publicize Phillis Wheatley's book. He helped sell copies of her book. We know this. And he was a correspondent of her. So she had been freed sometime between September and October of 1773. In February of 1774, she's had written to Occam, and this is probably her most direct comment on slavery. And notice that she combines the idea of the biblical authorization of freedom by linking herself and her fellow Africans with the Israelites in the Old Testament who had suffered under Egyptian slavery, and also with an argument from what we would call reason or liberty. So she says to Occam, she writes to Occam, "Reverend and honored sir, the glorious dispensation of civil and religious liberty are so inseparably united that there is little or no enjoyment of one without the other. Otherwise, perhaps, the Israelites had been less solicitous for their freedom from Egyptian slavery. For in every human breast, God has implanted a principle which we call love of freedom. It is impatient of oppression and pants for deliverance. And by the leave of our modern Egyptians, in other words, the European and American enslavers, white enslavers, I will assert that the same principle lives in us. This I desire not for their hurt, but to convince them of the strange absurdity of their conduct, whose words and actions are so diametrically opposite. In other words, she's talking about the Americans who are claiming that they deserve liberty, freedom from British rule. How well the cry for liberty and the reverse disposition for the exercise of oppressive power over others agree, I humbly think it does not require the penetration of a philosopher to determine. So she ends on a pretty sarcastic note. And as I say, that was her most direct to date discussion of slavery, her attitude to slavery. Now, whereas earlier she had quite brazenly almost written to the Countess of Huntingdon, in the winter of 1795-96, she wrote a letter to George Washington and included a poem addressed to him, celebrating his appointment as the commander-in-chief of the American colonial rebel forces in America. Now, of course, George Washington was a slave owner. He owned many slaves at the time. And George Washington actually wrote back to her, commending her on her poem and acknowledging her status as an American poet. Again, this is part of her claim, implicit claim, to becoming the poet laureate of the new, what would soon become the United States. George Washington was not the only person, of course, who acknowledged her status. She was also acknowledged by fellow authors of African descent, one of whom was Ignatius Sancho, he had been formerly a slave. He was eventually freed. He became a very significant figure in British society. He became the butler and to the Duke of Montagu, which position gave him access to the royal family. He was a great letter writer after he had become free, and his letters were published 2 years after his death. And one of these letters, he becomes the first Black literary critic. And he writes about Phillis Wheatley's poems because he had been sent a copy of her book of poetry sent to him by a Quaker, Jabez Fisher, in 1778. Now, of course, Phillis had been freed in 1773, but Ignatius Sancho didn't know this. He knew of her from the book that he was sent. But notice he says Phillis's poems do credit to nature and put art merely as art to the blush. It reflects nothing either to the glory or generosity of her master, if she is still his slave, except he glories in the low vanity of having in his wanton power a mind animated by heaven, a genius superior to himself. The list of splendid titled learned names in confirmation of her being the real authoress, alas, shows how very poor the acquisition of wealth and knowledge are, without generosity, feeling, and humanity. These good, great folks all know and perhaps admired, nay, praised genius in bondage, and then, like the priests and Levites in sacred writ, passed by, not one good Samaritan amongst them. In other words, he's saying that these supporters of Wheatley were happy to support her when she was famous and when she was patronized by the Countess of Huntingdon and supported by her owners. But as soon as that ended, they just ignored her. Another Black author in America who recognized Phillis Wheatley, and I'm just giving the title of his poem here, Jupiter Hammond, an address to Miss Phillis Wheatley, Ethiopian poetess in Boston, who came from Africa at 8 years of age and soon became acquainted with the gospel of Jesus Christ. I also want to draw your attention to one of Phillis's last poems that we have, on the death of General Wooster. This is the same David Wooster that she had written that great letter to in October of 1773, telling him of her freedom. And in this letter, she is imagining herself, again, ventriloquizing the voice of General Wooster, who had been killed in battle. And she again here addresses very directly the issue of slavery and the hypocrisy of the American rebels who are fighting for freedom, but not for freedom for everybody. But how presumptuous shall we hope to find divine acceptance with the Almighty mind, while yet, O deed ungenerous, they disgrace and hold in bondage Afric's blameless race. Let virtue reign, and thou accord our prayers, be victory ours and generous freedom theirs. Okay, so by 1778, she's got colonial throughout the colonies in America and transatlantic fame. She's riding high, she's getting acknowledged and recognized. She's still living with John Wheatley, who dies in March of 1778. On April 1st, she announces the intention to marry John Peters, a free Black man in Boston. They marry on Thanksgiving Day of 1778. Everything seems to be going great for her. She advertises a second volume of poetry, looking for people to subscribe to, in other words, to sign up, promising that they would buy it when it's published. In 1779, she's advertising that. She says that it's going to be dedicated to Benjamin Franklin. Her husband, John Peters, like many people in the colonies, has multiple occupations. His main one at the time is as a trader, trading goods throughout Massachusetts. He, fortunately for us, anyone who's doing research on him, he has a lot of interactions with courts, with the legal records. He's often suing people, and they're often suing him. This was very common in the 18th century colonies when you're trying to collect debts that are owed to you. So in 1779, she's advertising for subscribers to a new volume. The volume is never published because they never got the subscribers that they were hoping for. It was, of course, a very bad time for a market. 1779, the war is pretty much at its height. But in 1779, they're doing very well, as I say. And then suddenly from late 1779 to 1784, she drops off the map. And one of the places she may have dropped to was Wilmington, Massachusetts, because we are told in the first biography of Phillis Wheatley that was published in the 1830s, that she and her husband went to Wilmington, Massachusetts. Now, why would they go to Wilmington, Massachusetts? And why would we not have any record there that we know of her having been there? Well, what happens, I think, what accounts for this, I think, is the fact that while John Peters was trading, he was a merchant, he was winning some lawsuits for not a lot of money, but enough money. We know from tax records how much he was worth, how much property he owned. And unfortunately for him, at the same time that he was suing people that owed him money for goods, he was being sued by a woman who was sold goods at wholesale. So she was probably the person who the wholesale person from whom he bought the goods that he sold at retail. And the amount that she was suing him for was much more than his total worth. Now, this lawsuit ran through 1780. And the only way you could escape debtor's prison, well, they didn't have a separate debtor's prison. Debtors were also sent to the general jail. The only way you could avoid jail for a debt in the 18th century was to either hide in your house, never come out, or go to jail and hope that your creditor dropped the charges, eventually got tired of them, or you fled during the night and hid out. And I think that's what he did. And I think what they did was to flee to Wilmington. Now, one of the reasons I think they fled to Wilmington, if they went to Wilmington, is that during the course of the trial, his court records show that he was charging the court, he was trying to get the money to cover his 30-mile round trip to Boston. And this is before, of course, he was, before the court found in favor of the woman who was suing him. And that 30 miles would account for the round trip from Wilmington to Boston. So he lost his lawsuit. And so I think he was just hiding out. He doesn't reappear in the records until 1784, just after the wars officially ended. He opens a grocery store in Boston, and he applies for a license to enable him to sell alcohol at his new grocery store. He's almost immediately arrested for debt. And this is in September. We know that in September 1784, he's in jail for debt. On December 5th, 1784, Phillis Wheatley dies. He's almost certainly still in jail for debt. He can't come to her aid. So Phillis Wheatley dies, probably in poverty, as far as we know, in poverty. Her legacy during her lifetime was mixed. Her legacy after her lifetime was also mixed for quite a while. People argued for and against her as evidence of what people of African descent were capable of in terms of education, in terms of producing literature. The most infamous negative comment about her was by Thomas Jefferson, who said that religion could produce a Phillis Wheatley, but it could not produce a poet. Others, of course, recognized her talents. There were arguments back and forth through the 19th century, through the 20th century, until the late 20th century, well, the last half of the 20th century. And of course, now her reputation, her status is unquestioned, and it's demonstrated visually in Boston, where you can visit her at Commonwealth Avenue. You can go there and talk to her because she was the model, of course, for the statue that you see here. And so I think I'll end there with Phillis Wheatley being recognized for the great achievements that she had.
Thank you so much, Vin. That was wonderful. Participants, if you would like to take a moment to put any questions you may have for Vin in the Q&A box, we will go ahead and ask those. Also, I realized that I'd never introduced myself. I'm Brittany Tuttle, the Teen Services Librarian here at the Wilmington Memorial Library. We also thank the Memorial Hall Library in Andover for partnering with us on this program. There are lots of Andover attendees in the audience tonight, as well as Wilmington attendees. So thank you all for being here. I was so excited to have Vincent present today after learning about Phillis's believed Wilmington connection. And I am here tonight because Phillis was a teenager when she began her career as a poet, which I think is remarkable. So we are still waiting, Ben, for some questions to come through. We had a great comment on Facebook Live. A participant who was watching on Facebook Live mentioned that she knew a little bit about Phillis Wheatley, but didn't realize the potential Wilmington connection. So I think that's great. I would love for everyone living in the Merrimack Valley to know that Phillis Wheatley may have lived here during her lifetime. So I'm so glad we're starting that tonight. We have a question. Did you find any evidence of George Whitefield visiting and preaching in Wilmington, as the legend says? Wondering if that also made Wilmington attractive to Phillis.
No, I haven't found evidence of his preaching in Wilmington, but I have to confess I didn't look for evidence of his preaching in Wilmington. Does the questioner know anything about accounts of his having preached in Wilmington?
Terry, please forgive me for revealing your name. It is Terry. Ben knows Terry well. So Terry is saying the town symbol is the Whitefield elm.
Okay.
And
we have that. Sorry.
So sorry, Ben. And he supposedly preached under the Whitefield elm.
But we don't know that for certain.
I'm sorry?
Do we know that for certain, Betty?
I don't believe it's for certain. Yeah. Terry is our town historian. So if she does not know, it's not for certain. Terry, please feel free to chime in the chat. The church would not let him in, Terry added. He supposedly preached under the Whitefield elm because the church would not let him in, but it's all legend.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'll have to look into that and see whether I can find out whether he, on one of his tours, whether he stopped in Wilmington. I mean, he certainly preached in Boston, including at Phillis's church.
Terry says, you looking into this would be amazing. And we agree. We did try in preparation for Vin's visit tonight to find some more information on Phillis Wheatley. We've looked through all of our digital holdings and even ancestry.com. We were unsuccessful. So if anyone out there has seen anything or has any definitive proof of anything, we would all love to see it. We've had another question. Did Phyllis know about Anne Bradstreet's work?
Not that we know of, but that's an interesting question, because Phyllis was the second woman in America to have a book published. Of course, Anne Bradstreet was first, a century earlier, but we don't. Phyllis never mentions Bradstreet. Doesn't. So I haven't seen any evidence that she was aware of her work.
Terry's just added, if you ever found anything to that effect, that would be amazing. I had some questions for you, Vin. I was wondering, how did you become interested in Phyllis?
Well, I had been publishing on early authors of African descent that had connections to Britain. And Phyllis had been dealt with by people who dealt with African American literature. And so they came at her from that direction. And they usually came at her from the direction of what followed her. In other words, who may have imitated her or known about her. So I thought about the fact that, well, she published a book in London. She had all of these British connections. When I looked at that letter to David Wooster in October 1773, whereas most of the people, or everybody I'd read, every critic I'd read who says anything about that letter is all excited about the fact that she says she met Benjamin Franklin. But when I looked at that letter, I got all excited about the fact that she met and was toured London with Granville Sharp, because I was very aware of what had happened in 1772. I was very aware of the fact that she says in that letter that she was freed at the desire of her friends in England once she returned to Boston. And so that was sort of my way in to Phillis Wheatley, was from my kind of training and experience in British lit and what was written before her and around her.
Oh, it's fascinating. I first found out about Phyllis Wheatley from an Anne Rinaldi book, and I've never forgotten it. And I loved reading about her when I was a teen, about Phyllis's age when she began writing. Vin, I have seen that particular image of Phyllis's book of poetry. Is there anywhere in the Boston area where we can actually see a first edition of her poems? Or is there one available on public display that you're aware of?
Well, on public display, you'd have to check the Massachusetts Historical Society. You can go to their website and you can, of course, see it online. They have a copy. I should say that the copy that I showed you, if we go back to that, whoops. Nope, one more. Okay, this copy is actually owned by Thomas Jefferson. This was Thomas Jefferson's copy, because which ended up in the Library of Congress when he donated his library to the Library of Congress.
Amazing. We have another question in the Q&A box. Oh, from Terry. Do you think there is a chance that Phillis went to a different Wilmington in another state?
I guess there's a chance. As I say, I'm going by that 30-mile round trip travel expense that John Peters gave to the court, which he did more than once. He made several trips to the court during the while this case against him was being adjudicated. So if we go, if that wouldn't account for the Wilmington as being Wilmington, Massachusetts, then it becomes even murkier, I guess.
Well, I know I'm certainly hoping that that is not the case and that she was indeed here in Wilmington, Massachusetts.
I haven't looked at how many other Wilmingtons there are besides Delaware.
I do know that there are a few because we occasionally get phone calls from people looking for other Wilmingtons. I'm not sure how close the nearest other Wilmington would be. Another Wilmington would be, I guess. So there's still time. If anyone has any more questions, please get those in the Q&A. I have put, in the chat, there is a Wilmington in Ohio, Vermont, and New Hampshire. I believe is what our attendee is saying, at least. Ooh, so that's more than I was hoping to hear.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's good.
Vin, I've put my email in the chat, btuttle@willamlibrary.org. Would it be okay if anyone had questions after tonight's presentation, if I forwarded those on to you?
Sure.
And certainly if we find anything tying Phillis to Wilmington, you will be the first to know.
Okay, yeah. I always like to find out what I missed. That's what scholarship is all about. It's a group project. It never ends.
Well, while we're just waiting to see if there are any last questions in the Q&A or messages for us in the chat, could we ask if you have any other research you're working on right now?
Well, I'm working on some things that are related to things that I had written before about the sort of networks of people of African descent across the Atlantic. One of the questions I thought might come up was about John Peters and whatever happened to John Peters, because the 19th century biography of Phillis Wheatley says that John Peters abandoned Phillis and he eventually went south. And so no one had pursued him. And I wondered, well, what happened to him? Can I find out what happened to him? After she died, he was in and out of jail for debt, but eventually he made a comeback. And like many people in 18th century America, especially during the Depression after the American Revolution, he had a variety of occupations at the same time. And we know this from the tax records. And he identified himself as a lawyer, a physician, a pintle maker, and as a gentleman, which is quite a claim for someone of African descent. So he had these multiple occupations. In the 18th century, you could be a physician or a lawyer without having attended medical or law school, both of which would have been closed to a person of African descent anyhow, but you did it by practicing it. And he earned a reputation for being litigious. In other words, suing too many people, such that he was charged with being litigious, after which he didn't have any more lawsuits. He stopped suing people. But eventually he did earn the status of a gentleman, and he died in 1801. He was still in debt, but we have the record of what his possessions were, and some of them were, fairly high status possessions.
That's fascinating. I certainly have questions about John Peters. Thank you for telling us more about him. So we have one final question in the Q&A. An anonymous attendee is asking, in one of her most quoted lines, Wheatley writes, "Remember, Christians, Negroes, black as Cain, may be refined and join the angelic train." Could you say something about refinement for slaves? Do you think she saw herself as a commodity to be refined, like sugar, which I'm assuming ties back to Cain in her poem?
Right. Okay, this line is from her what Henry Louis Gates Jr. calls her most despised poem, on being brought from Africa to America, in which she talks about she addresses this concept that it's her being enslaved in Africa and brought to America was a kind of fortunate fall. And I think the refined there refers to her being given access to Christianity, which in a number of the authors of African descent, especially in the 18th century, they had to contend with the sort of paradox of being physically enslaved and yet spiritually freed through access to Christianity, if they believed in Christianity. So that I think the refined there is being used primarily in a spiritual sense. Now it's possible that she's playing with refined as a reference to her physical enslavement. That line, remember, that begins, remember, the line that you read, can also be read in more than one way, because is she saying that, remember that, it depends on how we punctuate it. Is she saying, remember, since it's imperative, there's a sort of implicit that, remember that, is she saying to Christians, remember that Africans can be black as Cain, though they can be refined from that? Or she's saying, remember, and implicitly, remember that Christians, Africans, in other words, both Africans and Christians, black as Cain, is the black primarily physical, phenotypal reference, or is it black as in sinful black, metaphoric black, in which case both whites and Africans would be black in sin, and then refined from that. It's a line that is, to me, interesting in its possibilities. I don't know if that answers the anonymous's question, but
I believe it does. And we don't have any follow-ups in the chat or in the Q&A. So, oh, we have one more question. Yes, thank you. And the anonymous attendee says.
well, thank you for your question, anonymous.
So if there are no more questions or comments in the chat, I believe our hour with Vin is up, and we thank you so much for being here tonight and teaching us more about Phillis, about her life and her works and her legacy. I was so excited to learn more about her. So thank you so much, Vin. Attendees, thank you so much for being here. This recording will be available as soon as I can get it on YouTube. It's already on our Facebook page. Another attendee, many attendees are thanking you, Vin, so much for a fine presentation and your research. There is also another comment about another Wilmington, of course, the famous one in North Carolina. And I also just wanted to remind our attendees that we do have some more events coming up this week and next week. We have an anti-racism dialogue for teens with Dr. Raul Fernandez. There's still time to register, and we hope you will join us. And then on Tuesday, the 29th, not only do we have a voter registration drop-in event, voters who are too young to vote but are age 16 plus are invited to also pre-register. We will also have on that day, I'm a Good Person, Isn't That Enough? A virtual evening with Debbie Irving. And you can register for those events right on our events calendar at willamlibrary.org. So Vin, any final thoughts before we let you go this evening?
Oh, just thank you, Britt, and thank everybody who's listened for having given me a chance to talk about Phillis Wheatley, one of my heroes.
One of mine too. Thank you so much, Vin. And we certainly hope that we will find research to send your way. So with that, I will stop our recording and our Facebook live stream. And I thank you so much for being with us tonight, attendees. And Vincent.